The American major had been searching the Austrian mountains for 6 hours when he saw the face. Not the uniform, the face. The man standing in the courtyard of a farmhouse outside Kitzbühel was wearing the field gray of an Austrian private soldier. Rank insignia of a man who had never commanded anything larger than a squad. The boots were wrong. The posture was wrong. And the head, the distinctive, egg-shaped head that Major Cecil Alton Simmons, 33 years old, a former police officer from Grand Rapids, Michigan, had studied in a briefing photograph 14 days earlier, was unmistakably, absolutely correct. It was the afternoon of May 26, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 18 days. Simmons crossed the courtyard. He stopped 2 feet from a man in the Austrian private's uniform. He said one sentence. He said, "I know who you are." The man did not respond for approximately 4 seconds. Then, slowly, against what must have been every instinct in a man trying to disappear, he straightened. The spine corrected itself. The shoulders came back. The jaw set. It was the involuntary correction of a man who had spent his entire adult life being obeyed, and who could not fully suppress it even now, even here, in a farmyard in the Austrian mountains wearing a dead private's uniform. Simmons put his hand on his sidearm. He did not draw it. He said, "SS Obergruppen für Oberg, you are under arrest." And what the man said next, the words that came out of the mouth of the higher SS and police leader of occupied France, the man whose administrative signature sat above the deportation orders for more than 40,000 human beings, is the reason this story exists. And when those words reached Patton, what Patton said in response has been sitting in a record box in the National Archives for 80 years. Most people have never read it. Subscribe. This channel exists to keep stories like this alive. Karl Albrecht Oberg was born on January 27, 1897, in Hamburg, the son of a professor of medicine. He was 48 years old when Simmons found him in that farmyard. He had enlisted in the German army in August of 1914 at the age of 17 and had fought as a lieutenant on the Western Front, where he was awarded the Iron Cross first and second class. He had come home from that war in 1918 to a Germany that was defeated, humiliated, and economically disintegrating. And in the chaos of the years that followed, he had made the choices that a significant number of German men of his generation made. Choices that, in the moment, felt like the choices of men who understood what Germany needed and were willing to do something about it. He joined the Nazi Party on April 1, 1931. He joined the SS 6 days later. In May of 1933, he met Reinhard Heydrich, the head of the SS Security Service, the man who would later become the primary architect of the final solution, and he asked Heydrich for a job. Heydrich gave him one. Over the following 12 years, Oberg rose through the SS structure with the methodical, documented efficiency of a man who understood that advancement in the system he had chosen came from one thing and one thing only: the willingness to carry out, completely and without hesitation, whatever the system required of him. He did not hesitate. The record does not show a single instance of hesitation. In May of 1942, Reinhard Heydrich appointed Oberg as higher SS and police leader for France. The title sounds administrative. What it meant, in practice, was that Oberg now held executive authority over every SS unit, every Gestapo office, and every security apparatus operating in a country of 40 million people. He had the power of life and death over the entire occupied population of France, and he used it within weeks of his arrival. In July of 1942, 2 months after taking his post, Oberg coordinated with the Vichy French police to carry out an operation that would become one of the most documented atrocities committed on French soil during the entire occupation. It was called, by the French, the WWII Roundup. WWII is an abbreviation of Velodrome de Hiver, the winter cycling stadium in Paris, located in the 15th arrondissement. Over 2 days, July 16th and 17th, 1942, 7,000 to 9,000 French police officers, operating under the coordination that Oberg's office had established with the Vichy government, went door to door in Paris before dawn. They arrested 13,152 Jewish men, women, and children. The records of the Paris Police Prefecture give the breakdown with the precision of an administrative process. For 1,115 children, 5,919 women, 3,118 men. They were taken to the Velodrome de Hiver and held there, without running water, without functioning sanitation, with one doctor for more than 10,000 people. The glass roof of the stadium had been painted blue for blackout purposes. It cast a greenish light over everything inside. Survivors described it that way for decades afterward. The greenish light, the smell, the children who did not understand why they were there. They were held for 5 days. Then they were transferred to transit camps outside Paris. And from the transit camps, they were put on trains. The trains went east. Of the 13,152 people arrested in those 2 days, approximately 811 survived the war. Of the 4,115 children, the number of survivors is so close to zero that the historians who have spent decades on this subject have not been able to confirm it is above single digits. Think about that for a moment. 4,115 children. The number that historians can confirm survived is in the single digits. See, what most people don't realize is that the WWII was not an isolated event. It was the beginning. Between May of 1942 and August of 1944, when the Allied liberation of Paris ended his authority, Oberg's administration coordinated the deportation of more than 40,000 Jewish men, women, and children from France to the extermination camps in the East. 40,000. That number comes from multiple independent sources. The post-war French government commission that spent years documenting the deportations, the Nuremberg trial records, the French military tribunal that later tried Oberg, and the records of the railway system that documented the transports. 40,000. And alongside the deportations, Oberg signed and authorized the execution of hundreds of French civilians designated as reprisal hostages. A resistance act, a sabotaged rail line, an attacked German soldier, a cut communications cable, would generate a reprisal order from Oberg's administrative chain. The order would specify a number. The number would be taken from the detention facilities. The men would be shot. Their names were sometimes published in French newspapers as a warning. Most of the time, their families simply stopped receiving letters and never received an official explanation. This is the man who, on the afternoon of May 26, 1945, in a farmyard in the Austrian mountains, straightened his spine and invoked the Geneva Convention. I am a general officer of the waffen-ss. Under the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention, I am entitled to be treated in a manner consistent with my rank. I demand that my status as a prisoner of war be formally recognized. Major Simmons's interpreter finished the translation. Simmons looked at Oberg for what the arrest report describes as approximately 6 seconds. Then he said, "Get in the vehicle." Those were the first 6 seconds of a process that would eventually reach Patton's desk. And what happened when it did is what this story is actually about. The disguise had not been improvised. That is the first thing the post-war investigation established. And it matters because it speaks to what Oberg had been planning and how long he had been planning it. In the final weeks of the war, as the Allied armies drove into Germany from the west and the Soviet armies came in from the east, Oberg had obtained, through channels that investigators spent months attempting to trace, a complete set of Austrian enlisted man's documents, a private soldier's field uniform, and a cover story. He was Private Johann Kellner, 48 years old, from Innsbruck, a support soldier, non-combat, nothing worth looking at twice. The cover story was built to survive a routine checkpoint by a tired American soldier at the end of a long war. It was not built to survive Major Cecil Alton Simmons, who was not tired, who was not at a routine checkpoint, and who had spent 14 days memorizing the faces in a briefing package that listed 37 senior SS personnel likely to attempt flight through the Austrian Tyrol. Oberg's photograph had been on page 4. The notation beside it read, "Distinctive cranial profile, recognition likely despite uniform change." Simmons had read that notation. He had looked at the photograph carefully. And when he crossed a farmyard in the Austrian mountains on May 26, 1945, and saw the egg-shaped head above the Austrian private's collar, he did not need the documents to tell him what he already knew. The arrest report that Simmons filed that evening at the 3rd Army Processing Facility at Freising, 24 kilometers north of Munich, is a 3-page document. It records Oberg's apprehension at 2:17 in the afternoon. It records the interpreter's presence. It records that Oberg did not resist. And it records verbatim in the interpreter's transcription the statement Oberg made after Simmons identified him and informed him he was being taken into American military custody. The statement is 3 sentences. The first sentence identified his rank. The second invoked the 1929 Geneva Convention. The third used the word demand. Captain Leonard Dravicki, 28 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio, the processing officer at Freising who received Oberg the evening of May 26th, wrote a notation at the bottom of his copy of the arrest report. The notation read, "Prisoner has repeated POW status demand 3 times since intake. Request guidance from higher command." That request went up the chain at 8:14 in the evening. It reached 3rd Army Headquarters the following morning at 9:37 a.m. The duty officer who received it was Colonel James Waverly Hobbs, 43 years old, from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Hobbs read the request once. He read it again. He made a note on the routing form. Then he picked it up, walked down the corridor personally, and placed it on Patton's desk. He did not put it in the distribution system. He carried himself. He would explain later, in a post-war account, why. He said, "There are some things you carry yourself, and let the general decide what to do with them." Patton read the routing form. He asked Hobbs one question. He said, "Is there a file on this man?" Hobbs said yes. Patton said, "Bring it." The file was 41 pages. Patton read all 41 pages. His aide, Captain Charles Codman, was in the outer office. He heard nothing from Patton's side for the 22 minutes it took. No dictation, no telephone calls, no movement, just the sound of a general reading 41 pages about what Karl Albrecht Oberg had spent 3 years doing in France. And then Patton called Codman in. He said, "Give me a legal pad." Before the legal pad, there is the file. Because the 41 pages are the reason the legal pad matters. And the 41 pages require a moment. Because the 41 pages are where this story stops being about Oberg and becomes about the people Oberg's Geneva Convention demand was designed, however indirectly, to protect him from answering for. The file had been assembled by 3rd Army's Counterintelligence Corps beginning in April of 1945, as American forces swept through the territories that German administration had controlled, and as the records left behind in the German retreat came into American hands. 3 CIC officers spent 19 days going through the files recovered from the former SS and police administration offices in Paris. The German administrative machine had been meticulous in its record-keeping. It had not been meticulous enough in destroying those records before retreating. What the CIC found filled cabinets. What they cataloged from those cabinets over 19 days became the 41 pages. Page 3 of the 41 was a copy of the WWII Coordination Authorization, the document that established the operational relationship between Oberg's office and the Vichy French police for the July 1942 Roundup. Oberg's administrative authority was cited in the chain on page 3. Pages 14 through 22 covered the hostage execution orders. 17 separate orders spanning August 1942 through October 1944, each specifying a number of hostages to be shot in reprisal for a resistance act, each traceable through the administrative chain to Oberg's office. And pages 35 through 37 were something different. They were a summary of a survivor's testimony. Her name was Rachel Simone Bergman, 38 years old, from the 10th arrondissement of Paris. She had been arrested on the morning of July 16, 1942, at 4:47 a.m., when French police knocked on the door of her apartment. She had been held in the Velodrome de Hiver for 4 days. She had been transferred to Drancy. She had been pulled from the transport list by a French police inspector named Maurice Gallet, who forged her documentation at significant personal risk and whose name appears in the post-war records as having been recognized for this act after the liberation. Rachel Bergman had given her testimony to a French government commission in October of 1944. The commission had forwarded a copy to the American military government. That copy had reached the CIC file. The 3-page summary that Patton read on pages 35 through 37 described, in the Commission's own clinical language, what she had witnessed inside the Velodrome de Hiver during those 4 days. The summary covered the conditions. It covered what happened to the children who became separated from their parents inside the stadium. It covered what the people around her understood as the days passed about where the transports were going. Patton read all 3 pages. Codman heard nothing from the other side of the door for the 22 minutes it took to read all 41 pages. Then Patton called him in. "Give me a legal pad. Here is where it gets serious. Not loud, not theatrical. Serious. The way a man who has just read 41 pages about what one human being spent 3 years doing to other human beings gets serious when he is asked to rule on whether the human being is entitled to the protections of a document designed to protect human beings from exactly what he spent 3 years doing to others." Oberg's demand was not legally frivolous. That is important to understand, because what Patton was dealing with was not a simple question. The 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war did, in certain circumstances, apply to members of the Waffen-SS. By 1945, Waffen-SS divisions had been fully integrated into German military operational command. The argument that a Waffen-SS general officer, captured after the cessation of hostilities, was entitled to prisoner of war status was an argument that some officers had successfully made in the immediate post-war period. Oberg knew this. He had not spent 6 days in an Austrian farmhouse working on a disguise and a cover story without also working on a legal argument. Prisoner of war status was not merely a matter of better accommodations. It carried substantive legal implications. A prisoner of war was entitled to protection from prosecution for acts committed in the course of lawful military operations. He was entitled to be repatriated at the end of the conflict period. What Oberg was demanding, when he said, "I demand to be treated as a prisoner of war," was a legal classification that would make it significantly more complicated to try him for the systematic deportation and death of more than 40,000 people. The Geneva Convention demand was not a request for humane treatment. It was a legal maneuver, and it arrived on Patton's desk wrapped in a routing form from a 28-year-old processing officer in Freising who had written, "Request guidance from higher command." Patton wrote for 11 minutes. He wrote on a yellow legal pad, in his own handwriting, for paragraphs. His aide heard the scratch of the pen for 11 minutes, and then silence. Then Patton called him back in and handed him the legal pad page. The page was sent down the chain to Colonel Hobbs, who transmitted it to the Freising facility as the Third Army's response to the prisoner's demand. The first paragraph stated that Oberg would be held in American military custody pending transfer to appropriate judicial authority. The second paragraph stated that his demand for prisoner of war status was denied. The third paragraph was Patton's explanation. It ran 11 lines. It said this: "The Geneva Convention of 1929, which this man has invoked, was written to protect human beings removed from a conflict by capture. It was written by people who understood that war, however brutal, operates within a framework of rules that distinguish it from the deliberate, systematic killing of civilians who have committed no military act and posed no military threat." This man did not operate within that framework. He administered a machine whose documented purpose and documented output was the deportation and death of human beings, men, women, and children, who were entitled, under every legal instrument this man now wishes to invoke, to exactly the protections he spent 3 years ensuring they did not receive. The convention he cites protects soldiers. He was not a soldier. He was the administrator of a killing apparatus. He does not get the protections of a framework he spent 3 years dismantling for others. The fourth paragraph was 3 words. Denied. Process him. Now let me tell you about a few of the people those 3 words were written for. Because the numbers 40,000 are accurate and important, but they are also, in a specific way, the kind of number that can sit in a sentence without fully landing. So let me give you some of the names inside the number. Samuel Blyman was born in Paris on June 15, 1930. His parents, both Polish, had come to France at the end of the 1920s. His father, Azriel, worked as a tailor. His mother, Chawa, ran a small grocery store in their neighborhood. When war broke out in 1939, Azriel joined the Polish forces fighting alongside the French. He was demobilized after the French defeat and returned to Paris. In the spring of 1941, he was arrested in what the French called the Green Ticket Roundup, an earlier mass arrest that predated the WWII. He was sent to the internment camp at Beaune-la-Rolande, south of Paris. In June of 1942, a family photograph was taken. Samuel, 12 years old, wearing the yellow star that the occupation had required Jews to wear since May, standing next to his mother. The photograph was taken for his father, who was at Beaune-la-Rolande waiting to be deported. The family knew he would be sent somewhere. They did not know where. They wanted him to have an image of his wife and son. Azriel Bleiman was deported to Auschwitz on June 28, 1942. He had not come back. Samuel survived the war in hiding. He has described the photograph many times in survivor testimony. He says, "Every time I look at it, I see everything we went through. It is a memory of our lives before the running." Her name was Renée Baricki. She was born in Paris. July 16, 1942 was her 6th birthday. On the morning of her 6th birthday, French police came to arrest her family. She and her mother escaped. Her father did not. He was deported the following day, July 17, 1942. Renée was 6 years old on the day the operation that Oberg's office had coordinated separated her from her father. The record does not state what she understood about what was happening. She was 6. She was in Paris. It was her birthday. The record states what happened to her father. There were 4,115 children in the Velodrome de Hiver by the end of July 16, 1942. 4,115 children. The youngest were infants. The oldest were in their mid-teens. They had been arrested with their parents in the pre-dawn hours, taken through the streets of Paris in the summer dark, held in a cycling stadium with one working water tap for 10,000 people, and then separated from their parents and transferred east. The number of those 4,115 children who survived Auschwitz is, by the most careful historical accounting, not significantly above 0. These are the people for whom Patton wrote 11 lines on a yellow legal pad, and then 3 words at the bottom. These are the people whose existence, whose deportation, whose separation, whose death was the documented output of the administrative apparatus for which Karl Albrecht Oberg demanded Geneva Convention protection in a farmyard in the Austrian mountains on May 26, 1945. Sit with that. Now here is the part that most accounts of this story do not reach. And it is the part that, once you know it, makes the yellow legal pad and the 3 words carry a different weight than they would otherwise carry. Because Patton's response was correct. It was morally precise and legally defensible, and it said exactly what needed to be said. And it did not matter. Oberg was transferred from the Freising facility to the Allied War Crimes Detention System in the summer of 1945. He was held at Nuremberg during the primary trials, though he was not among the defendants in the main proceedings. He was interrogated by the Americans, then by the British, then by the French, who had the most specific interest in what he had done on their territory. By the time the French military tribunal convened, he had been interrogated 386 times. 386. The British military court sentenced him to death. In October of 1954, 9 years after Simmons crossed a farmyard in 8 steps, a French military tribunal in Paris sentenced him to death a second time for crimes against humanity committed in occupied France. He heard both sentences. He did not speak at either verdict. In April of 1958, the French president commuted the death sentence to life imprisonment. In 1959, a further decree reduced the life sentence to 20 years of hard labor. And on November 28, 1962, 17 years after the arrest, 17 years after the routing form, 17 years after Patton wrote for 11 minutes on a yellow legal pad, Charles de Gaulle pardoned Karl Albrecht Oberg. He was released from custody. He was repatriated to Germany. He settled in Flensburg, in Schleswig-Holstein, in the north of Germany near the Danish border. He was 65 years old. He was a free man. He died there on June 3, 1965. His death was recorded in local civil records. There was no statement from the French government. There was no statement from the German government. There was no public accounting of what his freedom meant in relation to what he had done. He died in a house in Flensburg, and the world did not, in any documented sense, stop to note it. George S. Patton died on December 21st, 1945, in Heidelberg, Germany, from injuries sustained in a car accident 12 days earlier. He was 60 years old. He never knew that the man whose Geneva Convention demand he had denied on a yellow legal pad in May of 1945 would be sentenced to death twice and pardoned once and die in a German city in 1965 as a free man. He wrote 3 words and handed the legal pad to his aide and went back to work. He had no way of knowing what the 3 words would and would not accomplish. He only knew what the 41 pages had told him. He knew what pages 35 through 37 said. He knew what the WWII coordination authorization on page 3 meant. He knew what 17 hostage execution orders across 14 pages documented. He wrote 11 lines and 3 words, and he was right about all of it, and it was not enough, and he died without knowing that it was not enough. That is the honest end of this story, not the satisfying end. The honest one. The yellow legal pad page was entered into the 3rd Army Administrative Records when those records were processed in 1946 following Patton's death. The records were transferred to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where they remain. The legal pad page is in Record Group 407, among the 3rd Army Administrative Correspondence files for the period May through June 1945. The handwriting has been identified by comparison with hundreds of other Patton documents in the same collection. The yellow of the paper has shifted over 80 years to a brown-tinged ivory. The ink has held. The 11 lines of the 3rd paragraph are still legible. The 3 words of the 4th paragraph are still legible. Major Cecil Alton Simmons, the former police officer from Grand Rapids, Michigan, who had crossed a farmyard in the Austrian mountains and said, "I know who you are," retired from the Army and returned to civilian life. He gave one recorded interview about the capture in 1963, 1 year after Oberg's pardon. The interviewer asked if he knew what had happened to the man he had arrested. Simmons said he had read about the pardon in the newspaper. He said he had sat with the newspaper for a while after reading it. He did not elaborate. He did not explain what sitting with the newspaper had been like. He said only one more thing about Oberg before the interview moved to other subjects. He said, "I remember what he asked for when I arrested him. I remember the exact words." He did not repeat them. The interviewer did not ask him to. The transcript of the interview ends there, on that sentence, and moves to the next question. 4,115 children in a cycling stadium in Paris on a July morning in 1942. That is the number that does not balance against anything that came after it. Not the 2 death sentences, not the 17 years, not the 3 words on a yellow legal pad. The number does not balance. It was never going to balance. What there is, instead of balance, is the record. The 41 pages in a box at Freising. The arrest report from a farmyard near Kitzbühel. The routing form from a processing officer in Cleveland who wrote, "Request guidance from higher command." And a yellow legal pad page in College Park, Maryland, with 11 lines and 3 words at the end, written by a man who read everything he needed to read and then wrote the only thing there was to say. The ink has held. Subscribe and share this with someone who needs to know what those 3 words meant and what they could not change. Hit like if you believe 4,115 children deserve better than what the pardon gave to the man who signed the orders that put them on the trains. The next story I'm going to tell you involves something found in the personal files of a senior SS officer captured by Patton's forces in the spring of 1945, a private list, handwritten, of names that the officer claimed he had been protecting, and what Patton's investigators found when they checked every name on that list.